around in the back seat to ascertain the effect of this witticism on one who wasn't insulted, but instead proud of pulling wool over authority's eyes long enough for it to show. In defiance of John's dictate, Chris stayed out of the house between dismissal from school and the barber's shop closing time for nearly a week. Nevertheless, the order was enforced at last, as it always had been, since he'd been transfixed by the cover of the Rolling Stones' first EP in the windows of record shops, and thus became no longer biddable when handed money for a scissoring and clippering that would humiliate and degrade him, as it would a village elder in Tsarist Russia being punished, as was common, by the removal of a flowing patriarchal beard. After the butchering was completed, Chris, itchy with the small strands that had gone down his collar, saw his obscene reflection somewhere in the flustered outside light. When everything turns red as hell, you don't plan precisely what you're going to do. He shouted something with a swear word in it. "What did you say?" screeched a headscarf-wearing neighbour who chanced to be passing, droplets of her spittle sprinkling in neon. With head bursting, Chris turned and ran. After the tale she told of the incident, Mr. Donald, crotchety from work, had made up his mind to confiscate Chris's Dansette record player and place him under house arrest for the rest of the weekend, except for church, and the minute he returned from school from Monday to Friday. When the epilogue on BBC television ended, however, John was about to embark on a manhunt when a police constable of blunt disposition knocked to tell him that someone who might have resembled the boy had been hit by a speeding train. His injuries were so numerous and so serious that you wouldn't have known he was a human being. He had no head. Several months after what coroner Francis F. Haddock had judged to be suicide while the balance of his mind was disturbed, the Beatles were to be invested as members of the British Empire. Learning of this, the writer of a letter to the Daily Express suggested that, if the group had to be so honoured, each member ought to capitulate to a respectable haircut prior to being presented to the Queen. In the wider world, the Indonesian government had already banned Beatle mop tops. Singapore was to follow suit, and a leader in a British Sunday newspaper had advocated a law that made short back and sides compulsory for men as a defence against what? Homosexuality? Communism? Anarchy? The abolition of national service? Reading at the dinner table? Going to the cinema on the Sabbath? Having fun? For those disenfranchised by the Swinging Sixties, did an element of suppressed envy translate into the bitterest priggishness? Perhaps it boiled down to just that. Certainly, it was understandable that many were eating their hearts out. If female, it might be because their dreary husbands were the only men they'd ever known in a biblical sense, or because their own adolescences had been defined by world wars. If male, perhaps what could have been a period devoid of serious responsibility had been blighted by being compelled to fight further foreign foes or to endure peacetime national service after the dreaded official-looking envelope had fluttered onto the doormat, requiring the recipient to report for an induction medical that, unless he'd been carried in on a stretcher, was a mere formality. Next, his hair would be reduced to tiny stalks like a cornfield after a combine harvesting, and he'd be kitted out with a dung-coloured uniform. During basic training, he'd be bawled at from dawn till dusk. When he slept, the square-bashing and the more sadistic NCOs would invade his dreams. There are images ingrained in us 1960s children of young men having been given very short haircuts and sent to the trenches to be butchered, believed post-punk renaissance.